Early in-person voting is in full swing for North Carolina's primary election. The longest list of candidates in the state is for the 13th congressional district.
Yeah, a whopping 14 Republicans are vying for that seat. CBS 17's Russ Bowen is joining us now. And Russ, you had a chance to sit down with one of them, Brad Knott.
Yes, I did. Brad Knott is a former federal prosecutor. We talked about how competitive his race is and his campaign's top issue, which is the southern border. I'm sure you're very aware of the fact that in order to avoid a second primary or a runoff, as most people would call it, you got to hit 30% plus one vote. Do you think you can do that with a crowded field of 14 on a ballot? And how are you setting yourself apart to avoid that second runoff?
Great question. The short answer is yes, we do. Again, we've secured a lot of positive momentum going into this point. When I filed, we were in last place. We've never run for office before, no name ID in this district. But we have garnered a lot of positive momentum. And our message of really focusing on seismic problems in our district, predominantly related to law and order and the border, is really resonating. And I'm one of the only candidates in this field, this very crowded field, and I should say the only candidate who's actually worked with law enforcement. I understand the law. As a former federal prosecutor, I have gone after and prosecuted these criminals. And so I know what it takes. I know what it takes to secure the border. I know what we should be doing differently on the ground, and that message is really resonating. So we expect to clear 30%.
It's not just about who's coming across the border, and you talk about this a lot. It's what they're bringing across the border as well, and this is something you've prosecuted quite a bit. No?
Absolutely. There's really carte blanche in terms of the types of dangerous drugs coming across the border. Fentanyl gets all the publicity, and rightfully so. It's killing more Americans aged 18 to 45 than any other substance or any other cause. But there's really a lot of other things coming across the border that are, if not as bad, close to it. You know, crystal methamphetamine. One of the points that I like to tell people on the campaign trail is when I started at the U.S. Attorney's Office, methamphetamine was roughly $1,250 an ounce. When I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, it was sometimes $250 to $300. And all of that is evidence of the supply. It is simply flowing across our border, as are a lot of other drugs. So fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, obviously. There's a lot of contraband coming across the border every day.
One of the things that we hear a lot as reporters, but so do voters, frankly. Yeah. So do people watching television who see any of these commercials, yours included. If I win, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Well, frankly, you can't do it alone, right? You can't do it alone. The truth of the matter is, you know, for the Republicans to get something done, they've got to win the White House. They've got to retain control of the U.S. House. And you really need 60 votes in the Senate, which is almost impossible, to be honest. And the same for the Democrats,
That's right.
You know, if you want to flip it around. So tell me what you think as a Republican that you can agree with when it comes to Democrats and the border?
Well, one of the things that's been a source of encouragement for me is on the campaign trail, regardless of party, and we've gone to talk to independents, we've gone to talk to more Democrat audiences as well, is the border is about a 75% issue. Everybody recognizes that the border must be secure. And there are various ways to do that really aren't that partisan. Enforcing the laws on the books. There should be an immediate right to deport or immediate deportation if someone's here that commits a felony. That should be a bipartisan position. So pushing common sense measures that enforce existing law and enable the enforcement of existing law, I think that could be a very widespread and popular proposal.
So for the record, where do you stand on aid for Ukraine?
Aid for Ukraine, in theory, I support it, but how it's being executed right now, I have real reservations. And overall, I'm a firm believer that we must secure our border and take care of problems here first. Once that happens, I think that supporting Ukraine makes a lot more sense, but not until that happens.
What about support for Israel?
Israel is a strategic ally, one that we have a lot of interests in supporting them, and I do support Israel in their current effort against Hamas.
One of the headlines over the course of the past weekend was a comment made by former President Trump, and you know, for the record, you support President Trump. You're very vocal about that regarding NATO, and if a certain NATO country may not have paid its dues, which are all due of all member nations, he might even encourage Russia to do what they will. I mean, what's your response to that kind of rhetoric?
Well, you know, I would encourage everybody to take it with a grain of salt. I certainly don't believe that Donald Trump would encourage an assault or an attack literally on members of NATO, but he does raise a good point that members of NATO need to pay their fair share. There are a lot of problems that face NATO right now, as we see with the war in Ukraine. And for far too long, members of NATO have been relying on American dollars, American military might to rest and to be protected. And he raises a very good point that this should be a team effort. It should be more of a collaborative endeavor in terms of everyone should pay their fair share to protect against these very serious threats.
So a reminder that the 13th newly drawn election lines include parts of Wake County and Johnson, Harnett, Franklin, and several other rural counties. It heavily favors Republicans, which is why incumbent Democrat Wiley Nickel is not going to run again. So coming up at 5:30, Brad Knott also weighs in on whether a former president can be charged with a crime that's alleged to have happened while in office. Guys.
It'll be really interesting to see with such a huge field of candidates how they differentiate themselves from each other as the campaign continues.
Can they get over that line? Because, I mean, if they can do it, and if there's a big dramatic difference between the first place candidate and the second place candidate, the second place candidate may choose not to even go for a runoff.
Yeah. It's going to be a fight for sure. All right.
doubt.
Russ, thanks. We appreciate it.